Welcome everyone to Enable Ottawa 2021 and our second online conference forum. Now in its sixth year, Enable Ottawa continues to bring together individuals and organizations from here at Carleton, the Ottawa region, and now thanks to the online platforms, we are of course able to engage a global audience and an international roster of presenters, all with an invested interest in supporting the accessibility agenda through the burgeoning world of those innovative technologies that are creating ever-increasing universal experiences for everyone. We are most thankful that these technologies allow us to stay connected with our many allies, partners, collaborators, and colleagues, and thank everyone for taking part in our event once again that we proudly host each year during National Accessibility Week. The speakers participating in this forum over the coming days represent a wide range of experience and perspective in the assisted and adaptive technology and design sectors, as well as those who are utilizing those technologies to help redefine experiences for all people. On behalf of the Enable Ottawa Planning Committee and Carleton, I welcome and thank everyone for participating. At this time, I would also like to acknowledge and thank His Worship, Mayor Jim Watson, who will be bringing opening remarks and welcome to tomorrow's Day 2 Living Day, which will explore how technologies are helping reshape and reframe the way people experience and navigate their worlds and communities in an increasingly universally accessible world. As a community, Carleton has an established history in creating such an environment, initially through its unique built environment and fundamental culture of accessibility. And today, we remain committed to build on our status as Canada's most accessible university and have further embedded accessibility into the university's strategic integrated plan with a new coordinated accessibility strategy, which is one of many projects and collaborations that fall under the mandate of the Research, Education, Accessibility and Design, or the READ initiative, as it is informally known on campus. Just a few of those other many examples include the Canadian Accessibility Network, which now in its second year is bringing together more than 60 members representing cross-disciplines and sectoral organizations in the public and private sectors to collaborate on accessibility issues in a pan-Canadian setting. We also continue to take pride in our work on research and program development, particularly through the Research and Education in Accessibility, Design and Innovation program, the first interdisciplinary university accessibility training program in Canada. Our student body shows the same commitment to accessibility, participating annually in the Council of Ontario Universities Innovative Design for Accessibility contest, and won for 5 consecutive years. And our support to our students extends beyond the classroom as students transition from the classroom to the workplace. The Accessible Career Transition Program is a career development service that provides support to Carleton students and alumni with varying abilities. And the Act to Employ program provides students with the opportunity to gain real-world experience by working in placements related to their area of study and interests. The David C. Onley Initiative for Employment and Enterprise, a 2-year regional partnership between the city's 4 post-secondary institutions, worked towards creating greater employment success for students and graduates with disabilities, while helping employers identify and make those inclusive changes that provided tangible benefit to their organizations. And now, the Skills Catalyst Project, a program that grew out of the Onley Initiative, has just last week launched a suite of learning modules designed specifically for employers interested in exploring and hiring for a great untapped pool of talent. And a year after the beginning of this global pandemic, we all recognize how our lives have been impacted and forever changed, and recognize that assistive and adaptive technologies will play an ever-increasing important role in creating an inclusive world. Carleton prides itself on continuing in its commitment to build on a culture of inclusivity, not only through its programs, but by hosting forums such as Enable Ottawa, ensuring that best practices are shared and that students are developing the skills critical for success in an increasingly digital economy and world. Now, before I finish, I would like to take a moment to thank the organizers of this event. So Carleton University Read Initiative and the Faculty of Engineering, the City of Ottawa, the Ottawa chapter of Tetra Society of North America, March of Dimes Canada, Neil Squire Society, IL Canada. And I would also like to thank AI Media, the world-class leaders in translation and captioning who are generously providing captioning for our online forum these next 3 days, and to the City of Ottawa for the financial support that has allowed us to include ASL translation as part of our service support this year. I would be remiss in not thanking and acknowledging the time and support of our many speakers who have taken from their busy schedules to participate in this knowledge exchange forum. Now, I'd like to introduce Anne McRae, Executive Director, IL Canada, and a member of the Canadian Accessibility Network, who will introduce this morning's plenary speaker. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Derek Featherstone has been working as a web professional since 1999 and is an internationally known speaker and authority on accessibility and web design. As a Chief Experience Officer at Level Access, he focuses on working with clients to shift from thinking about accessibility as a one-time project and moving towards thinking about accessibility as a sustainable program and as a manifestation of an inclusive culture. He coaches and mentors product teams on accessibility concepts, requirements, and processes needed for success before, during, and after design, development, and testing. Please welcome Derek Featherstone.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for inviting me here to speak with you today. I'll just take one moment to share my screen quickly as I have a slide deck to share with you. And could you just confirm that my slides are being shared and you can see them?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, wonderful. So this topic of my talk today is accessibility and inclusive design, and understanding the differences and the similarities between them. And I believe this fundamental in this fundamental sentiment that how we do our work actually matters. As I was introduced, I'm Derek Featherstone. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at Level Access, and the only thing we do is focus on digital accessibility, not just the outcome, but the process itself. And I'd love to share a few thoughts with you today on those. This is a tweet from 2016, and the tweet shows a photo of 6 oranges that are pre-peeled and are sitting on a grocery store's shelf. They're pre-peeled and in plastic containers. And the quote above the tweet from the person that posted this says, "If only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so that we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them." Interestingly enough, this, not surprisingly, this went viral, lots of people liking it and retweeting it, and basically saying this is an outrage that we're wasting so much plastic on these oranges. Why we don't need something to cover oranges, they come with a cover automatically. Interestingly enough, in the comments and the subsequent threads, people actually said, "Hey, I know this seems wasteful, but for me, I have quite severe arthritis and I can't peel an orange. So this is actually quite accessible to me. It's actually very useful to me." And that I've found to be really, really interesting. A lot of people commented on this saying, "Oh, I hadn't considered that." And I think, that's actually really a perspective I hadn't considered before. There's still much debate about it and about the environmental impact of using so much plastic on oranges. And one of the original people that actually has a disability came back to the thread and said this: "I mean, accessibility is nice and all, but that wasn't the thinking behind this product. It wasn't designed for disabled people." And this is something that I like to think of as something being accidentally accessible. We made it accessible. We didn't actually consciously think about making it accessible, but it ended up being accessible anyway. Now, there are lots of different ways to make something accessible. We can go into it with some good ideas. We can make a thing that we know is not accessible and go back and fix it afterwards. We can make something accidentally accessible like this, where it just happens to be accessible. And there's lots of different ways to approach this, making something accessible from the beginning. Now, I certainly don't advocate for making something that is intentionally not accessible and then going back and fixing it later, but we know that that does happen all the time. In reality, there are lots of different ways for something to be made accessible. And in this case, even though accessibility can happen by accident, I think our job is to actually be really intentional about it. We want to make sure that we are putting our thought, a good thought process into it, and being really intentional about accessibility and the end result of something being accessible. Now, a lot of people will ask me the difference between accessibility and inclusive design. And a lot of people use both terms interchangeably. They say, oh, I love inclusive design. And often what they mean is they love the outcome of inclusive design, in that they like using products and services and systems that end up being accessible and include people. I like to think of it this way, that accessibility is the outcome and inclusive design is a process. So we can include people in different ways. And if you think of accessibility as the outcome, the thing that we measure, and on the web, we measure that by measuring things against a standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But inclusive design is a process that we can use to achieve accessibility. So if you think of it that way, it kind of starts to highlight the differences between accessibility and inclusive design. The reality is we can create something accessible without ever talking to or working with or consulting or getting feedback from people with disabilities, and we can still meet that outcome of achieving accessibility. But we cannot practice inclusive design and engage in inclusive design as a process without actually including people with disabilities in that process itself. And if we aren't including people with disabilities in the process, we're not actually practicing inclusive design. So think of it that way. Think of two different levels of inclusion. We create products or services that are inclusive, but we also use a process that is inclusive by including people with disabilities in that process itself. Now, the best way to do this is to be thinking about diversity by default. And one of the best ways to understand that, and this is an often quoted phrase from Michael Masutha, who's a South African gentleman who he and another person actually kind of came up with this phrasing in the early 1990s, nothing about us without us. And the concept there is, if you are creating a product that we will use, if you are creating a service that we will use, if you are creating a policy that will impact us, you should not be doing that or going through that process or creating that without actually including us. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about what that might look like. Now, this is an idealized process that I've got on the screen here, and it shows a linear progression from left to right of an initial project concept, conducting some user research, doing some design iteration, some development and implementation, and then validation and launch. And that makes its way across the, in an idealized process from left to right. There are also a few arrows that I've got on the screen here. There's the main one that goes from left to right, but then there are some circular arrows as well, smaller ones around design iteration and development and implementation, and then one large one through the entire process. Ultimately, those are kind of signifying that regardless of what process we do, even though it looks like it's linear, there's still a bunch of circular and cyclical components to this, where we are actually actively iterating and going through different designs to try new things, trying to develop and implement things in different ways, and then using that concept of iteration through the entire process. Now, this is a very idealized process, and it may not be exactly what your team does. In fact, your team might actually follow a process that's a little bit more like this, where it's not exactly a straightforward pattern, and we make progress and we double back and we circle around, and we ultimately end up still pointing to the right, signifying some process. But ultimately, it's not always as easy as we like to think that it is, and process can get messy. What we tend to do when we say we want to include people with disabilities in the process, and this is certainly what happens on the web side of things, on the digital side of things, what we tend to do is incorporate people with disabilities into the process near the end, when we say we should do a usability study and do some research to figure out if the thing that we created actually works well for people with disabilities. And this is fairly typical. This is not the only way to do it. But one of the things that I would like you to think about as you look at this process, as you try to understand your own process, is that we are including people with disabilities here. Absolutely, no question about it. In fact, many people with disabilities would be ecstatic and happy to be included simply at the end like this, because so often they're not included in the process. So to include someone at the end versus not including someone at all is a really important step. But I'd like you to think about what this process, as I've depicted here, where the only involvement from someone with a disability is at the end. And again, this might be a usability study where we include 3 people with disabilities, 10 people with disabilities, hundreds of people with disabilities, of all different types of disabilities as well. I'd like you to think think of this not just as an expression of process, but think of it as an expression of power. We actually hold a lot of power in the design process. And in this process, we are setting things up so that people with disabilities are only involved at the end and not involved in the project conception, the initial research, the design iteration, development, and implementation. They're only involved at the end. And so what we end up saying here in many ways is we're including you, but we really want you just to tell us if we did it right or not. What we ideally should be doing is thinking about how we can actually make this work in a more equitable way, in a more responsible way, in a more ethical way. And that is to include people with disabilities all the way along. So the thing that I'd like for you to be thinking about is in your process is to start thinking about this action item. How can you include more people with disabilities earlier and more meaningfully in the process? That's an action that you can actually take. That is one of the first steps towards including people with disabilities more equitably within the design process. So instead of thinking about just having people involved at the end, we want to start thinking about how we can involve people with disabilities and how we can invite them as collaborators, as co-designers throughout the entire process. The way that we first depicted it with just that involvement at the end, we're basically saying, dear people with disabilities, please tell us if we did it right. If we're involving people with disabilities all the way along, we change that question from, did we do it right, to what things are the right things to do? By involving people with disabilities in the initial project concept, things where maybe people with disabilities have different ideas than we do as the designers. And I want to be careful with the way that I'm wording this here, because it sounds like I'm saying that there are no designers with disabilities and no researchers with disabilities. That's not the case. Regardless, we want to make sure that as a designer, we are getting perspectives from people with disabilities that we don't have. So whether you have a disability or not as a designer, it's quite possible that we get different perspectives from working with people with other disabilities. So it's really important to include people all the way along in the process rather than just at the end. And this is part of the reason that I think we need to start thinking about this concept of how we do our work matters. I also think it's important for us to look at that and at that process and look at the process that you have for design, regardless of what it is, whether you're designing digital things, whether you're designing a service, whether you're designing policy. We have to acknowledge the privilege and the power and the position that we have in that design process. So we need to make sure that we are always thinking about and including people that are not us in that process, and be mindful of that privilege and power and position that we hold. So I will do the same, and I generally acknowledge a few things as I'm going into a project or in this talk, and I will make this brief as well. My lens on inclusion is all about the work that I've been doing for the last 22 years, and that is all about accessibility for people with disabilities. I'm also very aware that that's not the only lens on inclusion. In many organizations, when we start talking about disability or diversity, equity, and inclusion, we start to think about gender and gender identity, gender expression. We think of race. We think of different nationalities and cultures. Sometimes we think about age, but as a different lens on inclusion. Those are all lenses on inclusion and different ways of looking at inclusion. But I see quite often that disability is often left out of that part of DE&I conversations. I'll also say I'm a white 49-year-old male. I'm Canadian with no disabilities that have resulted in discrimination or exclusion, or at least not yet. And I say not yet in that I might end up with some different disability at some point. I'm aging into it. I also have a disability right now. I was born with a club foot. And I don't think that club foot has actually resulted in any discrimination or exclusion yet. But that may happen. There might be a time in the near future where I end up needing accessible parking, for example, simply because as I'm older, I'm actually almost 50. My left leg is nowhere near as strong as my right leg, and that manifests itself. It's not as strong nor as flexible. And so that manifests itself in ankle pain, which works its way up to knee pain and hip pain and back pain and shoulder pain. And so there may come a time not too long in the future where I need accessible parking to minimize the amount that I need to walk into a store. And that would be specific to me. I also like to acknowledge this, and I hope you will too. Even though I know a lot, excuse me one second. Even though I know a lot about accessibility, there's a lot that I don't know, and I'm actively trying to learn about those other areas of inclusion and accessibility that I don't understand well. My apologies, pardon me. I think it's important for us to acknowledge these things in our work every day. So a few things to finalize a few thoughts here. I believe that how we do the work reflects what we value. There's a point where in the future, something being accessible is no longer a competitive advantage. It's no longer a thing that is unexpected. It's expected now, even though we're not always doing well at delivering on that. So there comes a certain time when all services, all products are accessible to a certain degree. And at that point, I think how we do the work starts to matter even more. Because how we do the work reflects what we value. and it needs to respect and value the lived experiences of people with disabilities. Everybody wants to feel valued. There's no question about it. In doing some of the research that I've done over the last year, I was heartened to see some quotes. And one of them was, as I was engaging in some of that research, I was asking questions, not about how we do work together, but it was more like, I was originally asking, how do you prefer that we communicate for this project? And I took the time and I actually thought about that. And I've changed that question to say, what's the most effective way for us to communicate on this project? And I get all kinds of feedback from people with disabilities saying, I appreciate it. Excuse me. I appreciate it when people take the time to ask questions like these. And I really appreciate you working to optimize the comfort of your interviewees in the process. I was excited to hear those things, to hear that the work that I was doing was meaningful and that people appreciated it. But it made me sad that that's not actually the default. We should be doing this all the time for everything. Feeling valued, just like accessibility doesn't happen by accident, feeling valued doesn't happen by accident. And how we do the work actually matters. So we want to take this, I think, through one final lens and one final thing, or one final way of looking at this. Can we meet, when we're designing a product, a service, a policy, can we meet these inclusion goals? And this is very simply stated, but we want to use an inclusive process. And in order to do that, we need to design with people with disabilities, not for people with disabilities. In other words, we want people with disabilities to be co-designers of that product, service, or policy with us. It's not just about us saying, we're going to do this and keep people with disabilities in mind. It's not about thinking, it's about action. How can we actively involve people with disabilities in the process itself, where we are designing with, not for? So some three goals that I basically have for inclusion and that I'd like you to be thinking about. Accessibility enables all of these, but we want to be thinking more broadly about inclusion. And so I think about participation or agency. You should have the ability and opportunity to participate in solutions that you will use and that will impact your life. I've actually started asking a question that I hope more people will start asking, because I think it opens up some really interesting conversations. When we go into a project thinking this is how the design process is going to go, we've already made a whole lot of decisions about, excuse me, we've made a whole lot of decisions about how people with disabilities will participate. And one of the questions that I like to ask now is, are there other ways that you'd like to contribute to this project? In other words, I don't know all of the things and all of the ways in which someone with a disability would like to contribute or would be an effective contributor to the project. So we need to start asking this. Are there other ways that you'd like to contribute to this project? I think of belonging and othering. Conceptually, your participation should be predicated on using the same tools at the same time in the same space, using the same process as anyone to the greatest extent possible. Now, I'll give you a really quick example of this. We were designing a workshop, I think, in about 2014 or 2015. And we were going to be at a conference, and we had some different ideas about how we would make the experience accessible. And I'm going to talk just about one particular disability here. That doesn't mean that that's the only disability that we were taking into account, but I want to use this one story just to illustrate this point here. We were very concerned. We knew that we had about 10 people coming to the workshop that either were using motorized wheelchairs, were on a mobility scooter, or might have even been using crutches. We knew that there were about 10 people out of about 60. this was an accessibility conference workshop, so there was actually going to be probably close to 50% of the conference participants or in our workshop that had disabilities. We immediately started thinking about, well, how is this going to work for someone that's using a mobility scooter or in a wheelchair? It might be difficult. We were going to get everybody to do some things on the whiteboard, and we decided that that might not be the most accessible solution, because people using their wheelchairs or their mobility scooters, the room might not have been set up well. They might have had difficulty using the whiteboards. So we thought, well, what we should do, what about using some butcher block paper, like big brown paper with some markers, and we could get feedback from people that way. And what we ended up doing was, or started going through the process, was setting it up so that there was a table where there was butcher block paper, and we removed the chairs around it. And we started going through this walkthrough of what the workshop was going to look like. And we started to visualize that in our head. And we saw people coming in our heads again, saw people coming through the door, some people going straight to the whiteboard, other people that were in, coming through on a mobility scooter or in a wheelchair. We had provided an accessible workstation for them by removing the chairs and having the butcher block paper there with markers. And so as we started going through the process of people joining us, we recognized that anybody that was not using a motorized scooter or a wheelchair was going to be up at the whiteboard, and only people that used wheelchairs or scooters were going to be at that one table. And we realized that the solution that we had created, even though it was more accessible to them, it was definitely not inclusive. In fact, we were actually singling them out. We were not creating a sense of belonging. We were practicing othering, in that we were saying, if you're using a wheelchair or a mobility scooter, you need to go to that table. Everybody else gets to use the whiteboard. And that's where this concept came from. Your participation should be predicated on using the same tools at the same time, in the same space, using the same process as anyone to the greatest extent possible. So what we ended up doing was not using the whiteboard at all, using the butcher block paper. We had an electronic collection mechanism as well, but every table had butcher block paper with markers. There were no whiteboard sessions. It was all on butcher block paper. We put that at every desk, and instead of removing the seats or the chairs around one table, we removed 2 from each table, so that not only did people have choice of where to work, they also had some choice on who to work with. So we were really happy that we made that progress and that switch in our thinking, that even though we had created an accessible solution by using one desk with butcher block paper, that it was not an inclusive solution at all. So one of the things that we should ask is, how might participation create isolation? We were actually, thankfully we didn't do this, but we were about to create a solution that would have isolated people with disabilities. And the final piece, value. Your participation in a process is valued rather than tolerated or accommodated. Now, I know that the word accommodation means actually some very specific things, and I don't want to take away from that. But part of the reason that we do accommodation is when the thing that we are originally doing is not accessible, and therefore some accommodation is needed. What we would ideally like to do, I think, is have solutions that are as inclusive as possible right from the get-go. And so your participation in a process actually should be valued rather than tolerated or accommodated. Excuse me. So final thoughts, and then we'll look at some questions here. We hopefully have a few minutes. If the ultimate expression of what we value is in how we do our work, what does how you do your work say about what you value? And I'd like you to take that forward and think about that, and the ways in which you do the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. Start thinking about how you do the work and what that says about the things that you value. a lot of these thoughts come from an article that I wrote in 2019. It's called How We Do Our Work Matters, Accessibility and Inclusive Design. And so that article is on LinkedIn. I'd love for you to read that, go into some more depth on some topics, and connect with me there. I would love to see that. I think we are right near the end here, so I'm just going to check the chat and see if we have a moment for questions or if we're out of time.
Just a quick moment, Derek, because we are pretty much to time.
All right, I see one question. Please comment on universal design versus inclusive design. Interesting question. I think that's a really something that we go into much more detail on, but I will give you my very quick version. Universal design tends to prioritize the concept that we have one thing that will work for everybody, right? And that is to have one, say, learning resource that will work for people with all different disabilities. And that's a great goal. That's a great outcome. And we actually can achieve accessibility by using universal design principles and design methodologies. Inclusive design doesn't necessarily mean that one thing will serve everybody's need. So the priority in inclusive design tends to be that we are including people in that process itself, right? So we can achieve accessibility through universal design. We don't ever have to, again, this sounds horrible. I don't like the way I'm saying it, but to practice universal design, we don't have to include people with disabilities in the process, right? We probably will, and we will have an accessible outcome at the end. But inclusive design ensures that we are including people with disabilities in the process itself.